All right, so welcome back to The Young Idealist, my ongoing series on classical German philosophy. Today I have a very special guest and a special episode, actually. On May 7th, a fantastic text came out for Schelling scholarship by a friend of mine, a very good friend of mine named Naomi Fisher. Her text on Schelling's Mystical Platonism. And so today I invited Naomi to come in to speak about this text and have specific questions. And I got a first-hand look at the text. She was very kind to send me a PDF of it. So Dr. Naomi Fisher is an associate professor of philosophy. Her research focuses on Kant, German idealism, and romanticism, specifically the relationship between nature, freedom, and rationality in Kant and Schelling. Currently, she's working on projects related to the impact of Plato and Neoplatonism on Schelling's philosophy, and she also has interests in the broader history of philosophy, philosophy of science, and the philosophy of religion. And I think you also are on the committee, right, or the governing board of the German Idealist and Romantic Society, I believe, right?
I'm an assistant editor of philosophy at the journal, the Skur Review journal. Yeah.
Excellent. Awesome. So the text that I'm very excited to start discussing with you, I'm going to read a little brief intro from the publisher. And it goes like this. Naomi Fisher argues that Schelling is committed to two overarching theses, which together comprise his mystical Platonism. First, Schelling considers the absolute to be ineffable and cannot be described in conceptual terms, and for this reason it remains inferentially external to any given philosophical system and is only intimated to us in certain analogical formulations, in works of art, or in nature as a second whole. Secondly, Schelling is committed to a kind of priority monism. All things are grounded in the absolute, but finite things possess an integral unity, all their own, and so have a distinct and relatively independent existence. Highlighting these commitments resolve an interpretive dispute according to which Schelling is a Fichtean idealist or a Spinozist, or he vacillates between these positions, interpreting Schelling as advancing, and mystical Platonism provides an alternative way of interpreting these earlier texts, such that they are by and large consistent. Naomi Fisher presents Schelling's early philosophy as a unique and compelling fusion of the old and the new. Schelling fulfills the characteristic aims of post-Kantian philosophy in a way distinctive among his contemporaries by drawing on appropriating various strands of Platonism. Now, this sounds fantastic. So welcome, Naomi, and thank you for being here.
I'm honored to be here, very happy to talk about the book, and thank you so much, Chris, for having me on.
Well, a little side note, Naomi is one of the first Schelling scholars that I got in contact to when I started the whole Schelling Facebook group, and we've been talking for a while, and I actually got to meet Naomi in 2022 at the Schelling conference, the 7th Schelling conference. So it was great to meet you and also great to read your text. So my first question for you is the following. The title of your text is Schelling's Mystical Platonism, 1792 to 1802. In the introduction, you bring up a couple of important distinctions of what Platonism is, guided by a modern lens. This is indicated by phases early, middle, and late Platonism, and also in reference to certain dialogues. What Platonism best describes Schelling's early philosophical project, and how is Schelling's own innovation in Platonism different to our own modern conceptions of Platonism and Neoplatonism?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I should say also, that was we spoke on the same panel on Schelling and Platonism. So Chris also had an excellent little paper on Schelling and Plato. But so yeah, to talk about Platonism. So the claim that Schelling is a Platonist may strike some as surprising, especially given contemporary conceptions of Platonism. So according to a certain popular conception of Platonism, like if you ask I don't know, a person on the street, someone who doesn't specialize in Plato, perhaps just or a random philosopher, what is Platonism? they'll typically say something like, well, there's the realm of being and the realm of becoming, and the realm of becoming is sort of this shadowy image, right, of the realm of being, and the realm of being is where the forms are. It's like this eternal, unchanging realm. And so that's a sort of standard view of what Platonism consists in. There are other associated things about politics or recollection, but nevertheless, to say that Schelling's a Platonist, and if you mean it in that way, that would be wrong, I think, because that kind of dualism between being and becoming doesn't sit well with Schelling's emphasis on unity, and the sort of denigration of the realm of becoming doesn't sit well with the sort of tenor of his philosophy of nature. And so, Schelling's not that kind of Platonist. But he is, I think, a Platonist in a sense, and it's a sense that was, relevant at the time that he was living and writing. So that the sort of more popular conception of Platonism is in part the result of certain kinds of developments in the 19th century, sort of historical critical methods, stylometric analysis, that enabled a kind of mapping of Plato's dialogues into early, middle, and late dialogues. So, the early dialogues being the more Socratic dialogues, the middle dialogues being the ones that we know the best, right? Plato's Republic, the Meno, the Phaedo. And then the late dialogues are ones that we don't really pay much attention to. Or, some people do, but most people aren't familiar with them. You don't sort of teach them to undergrads typically, say. So it's like the Sophist or the Parmenides, the Philebus. So those dialogues after the 19th century experienced sort of relative de-emphasis because that's not where the sort of central big Platonic doctrines are found. According to this developmental story, they problematize those middle period doctrines. In addition to this sort of developmental view of Plato, you also got a kind of, I guess, dismissal of Plotinus and the Neoplatonic tradition he inaugurated as, not faithful interpreters of Plato. So prior to, I think, the 19th century, it's very common to just appeal to Plotinus or Proclus or other Neoplatonists as authoritative interpreters of Plato. But post this 19th century development, and even in the 18th century, we see the term Neoplatonism coming into use. It's a kind of neologism meant to sort of distance these Neoplatonic figures from Plato himself. And so we can then approach Plato with our critical tools and sort of ignore this interpretive tradition. And for better or worse, I think that's just the lay of the land. Whatever you think of Plato and what the right interpretation is, and whether we can sort of see Plotinus as a faithful interpreter. So Schelling's Platonism is one that is, I think, informed by these late dialogues. So, the dialogues for Schelling were just a unified whole, right? These are all things Plato wrote. There's no sort of like, oh, these take priority. It's just these are all Plato's works. And so it's a kind of unitary approach to the dialogues. And certain late dialogues are more central, such as the Philebus, the Sophist. And what you get as a result, and I think there's other things you could say about this, but what you get as a result is a kind of hierarchy of being, where there's like epistemological, ethical, and aesthetic valuation sort of embedded within that hierarchy, such that, the good, the true, and the beautiful is like at the top, and then everything that exists exists sort of in relation to that highest principle. So we have like this unified hierarchy of truth, goodness, and beauty. And importantly, it's also a hierarchy of unity. So things exist to the extent that they're unified. They're beautiful to the extent that they exist and are unified. They're good to the same degree. And so that kind of hierarchical view subordinated to this highest principle is what I have in mind when I say that Schelling is a Platonist. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that answer. And you gave us a very nice and clear, concise answer to what Schelling's Platonism is. I have a further question, if you don't mind. In the book, you highlight certain Neoplatonic figures like Plotinus, Proclus, Pseudo-Dionysius, Ficino, and Bruno. Why these figures? Why do you see these figures coming out in um, Schelling's so-called Neoplatonism or Neoplatonic influences?
Yeah, I mean, I think those figures in particular have to do with his education at Tübingen. And so there's an excellent book by Michael Franz called Tübinger Platonismus, which is a sort of exploration of Tübingen at the time that Schelling, Hölderlin, and Hegel were students there. And he outlines the various kinds of approaches of those professors and their sort of own proclivity. So you see, like, for instance, and I talk about this in chapter 4, there's the sort of science and math professor, Fleiderer, who himself is a sort of specialist in Euclid. And you see, and it's extremely likely, and Franz argues, I think convincingly, that he would have been immersed in Proclus's commentary on Euclid's Elements. And you see elements, you see, if you read Proclus's commentary on Euclid's Elements, you'll recognize certain geometrical analogies that Schelling uses in his works to describe like mechanism and organism. He talks about like a straight line and a circle, and the straight line being limited to form a circle. This is all language that is pulled, I think, from Proclus's commentary on Euclid's Elements. Now, did Schelling read that commentary? Like, I don't know. um, but I think was he exposed to it through Fleiderer? Did Fleiderer lecture on it? I think, yeah, probably. And you see the same kinds of analogies in Hölderlin's work, for instance. So those kinds, that would be like an amazing coincidence if it wasn't the case that, that these two students were exposed to Proclus's commentary through this particular professor. So there are connections like that, and they're sort of too numerous to go into at length. But the other one is, of course, another main one is Giordano Bruno, who was a 16th century Renaissance Neoplatonist, and Schelling did read him directly. So in 1789, Jacobi publishes excerpts from this dialogue. He doesn't publish them as a dialogue; he publishes them just in, essay form. But they're pulled from this dialogue, the 1584 dialogue that Bruno wrote, and Schelling definitely read those excerpts. They're in part the basis for his 1802 dialogue, Bruno. So those are sort of certain philosophers that seem to really inform Schelling's Schelling's own reading of Plato. Another sort of important point of contact is perhaps commentaries. So there's Neoplatonic commentaries on Plato's dialogues. So by Ficino, by Proclus, and it's possible. We know Hölderlin was reading these commentaries. Was Schelling reading them? Possibly. He doesn't cite them in his notebooks or anything, but he doesn't write about everything he reads, presumably. Most of us don't. So I think it's likely that he was exposed to these thinkers during his education at Tübingen. He definitely engaged extensively with Plato directly during his time at Tübingen.
Well, see, now that last question and your answer kind of goes into our second question. What is Schelling's distinctive contribution to German idealism, and how does he differ, from other German idealists? I like this question because we were just talking about Tübingen and Hölderlin and Hegel being there with him and what they're studying, and now we're moving into, other elements of what makes Schelling distinct.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a sort of really fascinating biographical story to tell there as well. Sort of Schelling in 1794 just makes this abrupt kind of transition to like writing about Plato and biblical hermeneutics and things like this. Just he stops doing that and starts writing about like Fichte and Kant. So but let me just back up a little bit further to talk about, well, what is this Schelling's distinctive contribution to German idealism. Well, what is German idealism? And one way of characterizing it is in terms of, as a response to Jacobi's 1785 Spinoza letters. So famously, right, in 1785, Jacobi says, aha, philosophy, insofar as it fulfills its ideals of being a unified system of explanation subordinated to a highest principle, insofar as it does that, it lands you in fatalism and atheism. And so Spinoza is the sort of paradigmatic philosopher, right, because he fulfills those ideals. But insofar as he fulfills them, he's also like a fatalist and an atheist and denies freedom and all of that stuff. So in that context, right, there's also Kant's philosophy is starting to be received. And Kant is seen in this context as only sort of hanging on to the common sense convictions of theism and individual freedom and things like this by, failing to fully fulfill these ideals of unity and systematicity. So very kind of charges are levied against Kant, and even Kant himself sort of seems concerned that his philosophy has a kind of disunity to it. And so in that context, right, the German idealists come along and say, like, okay, we're gonna respond to Jacobi, right? This is like a challenge. We need to have like a unified system of philosophy subordinated to a highest principle that maintains these common sense convictions. And so we get different versions of this. And I think, what is unity? What is systematicity? What does it mean to be grounded in a principle? These are things that are still up for grabs. And so we see different versions of this in each of the German idealists, different versions of unity, different versions of systematicity. And Schelling, I think, offers a distinctive one, primarily through drawing on resources from Platonism. That's my view. That's a view I'm pushing in the book, is that, he achieves these aims in a really distinctive way, and that distinctiveness is highlighted when we look at those Platonic influences. So if you consider, say, like Reinhold in 1789 and in the early 1790s, he thinks of the sort of first principle as a most general principle, and it's supposed to unify the understanding and sensibility. And, I don't have it memorized, but it's something about the subject and the object and, that principle. And then everything is grounded in that principle insofar as it can be derived from that principle through specifications. So it's not that he says it's not contained, not the whole philosophy isn't contained in the first principle as if like an Iliad in a nutshell. Like it's not like all there built into that first principle. It's that we can specify that most general principle into its specific instances. So you can think of a model of this in the physical sciences. So for instance, like Maxwell unifies two theories, electricity and magnetism, through like coming up with a sort of more general theory of which these are specifications. And so that's the kind of model of unity that Reinhold's working with, and you can see how it comes with a certain model of systematicity. Fichte has a different kind of model of unity and systematicity. Everything is grounded in the sort of self-positing I through a series of conditioning relations. And this is, in some sense, a recursive kind of Iliad in a nutshell notion of systematicity and grounding, right? Because we begin with this first principle, and then we can derive sort of iteratively a series of conditions for that first principle. And both of these involve a kind of discursive derivation. And what I want to say is that Schelling is unique in this period of German idealism in that he thinks of that first grounding principle not as related in any kind of discursive way to the system of philosophy. So so he has arguments for why this is so. To put it briefly, any kind of articulation of this first principle is going to rely on conceptual divisions, is going to be in some sense conditioned by those divisions. And that would render this sort of supposedly first unconditioned principle conditioned. And so in order for it to be like truly absolute, truly unconditioned, truly the sort of foundational principle, it needs to be discursively external to any kind of system. It needs to be extra systematic. It needs to be ineffable. And so this first principle grounds the system in a completely different way than any other first principle grounds the system in, like, at least in Reinhold and Jacobi. Um, and the grounding relation, and I'll probably get to this later, but the grounding relation, I think, is best characterized in terms of participation, in which, like, every individual thing is a kind of image of the unity of the absolute, or sort of participates in the unity of the absolute. And then the sort of more discursive grounding relations within a system involve also unity. They're built out of, like, opposed contraries, unifications of opposed contraries. So Schelling really breaks the mold here, I think, in terms of, you know, what grounding unity is, what it means to have a system of philosophy, how to sort of think about the first principle of philosophy. And so that's really why I wanted to write this work, was to show, like, hey, you know, Schelling's not like these other guys. He's not, like, ever really a Fichtean. He's doing something totally unique, even from the very beginning. And we can see that when we look at these sort of Platonic resonances and influences.
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed so much about reading your book is exactly what was in your answer. You have such a nice way of showing the history of the kind of sporadic influences, especially with Reinhold. And I think Reinhold's a major figure, especially, you know, in popularizing Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 84 to 85. But it's nice how you display each of these influences. And it's not just Fichte and it's not just Spinoza. There's other things, which I really, really appreciated. I also like this idea that these objects are, in a sense, an image of the absolute. This is just super interesting. Um, so I'm already, you know, absolutely impressed with the text and how you're presenting all of these ideas and debates. So thank you again for your answer. My next question to you, I'm just firing them at you.
Yeah.
What are some of the main attributes of a mystical Platonism, and how do they play out in Schelling's philosophy from 1792 to 1802? Can we define Schelling as a mystical thinker? Now, this is a big question, so I apologize for the kind of magnitude of it, but um, I had to imply that. I had to throw that at you. Sorry.
No, it's a good question, and thanks for the kind words about the book. Yeah, I mean, the so as you indicated when you read the sort of description, there's two major theses. One sort of broadly metaphysical and one kind of epistemological, if you want to separate them out that way. Although I think they, like, definitely fit together. But the first is the priority monism, in which you know, we talk about that. I just talked about that grounding relation between the absolute and individual things, in which, like, things are a sort of image of the absolute in their distinctive kind of unity. Um, and that's bound up with other kinds of things in Schelling's sort of overarching, um, I don't know, philosophical picture that involves, like, potencies and ways of constructing a system. But let me focus, I guess, on the mysticism part, because um, that's the second sort of major thesis that I'm trying to advance, is that Schelling is not just a priority monist, but he's a mystic. And so I think, yes, Schelling is a mystical thinker. And I know that some people will balk at that. And so, for instance, I was just watching your great interview with Sean McGraw, and he's like, Schelling is not a mystic. Like, Hegel's the mystic, Schelling's not at all. And you know, I, of course, it's great to have people who disagree with you, and I'd love to sort of hash it out with Sean. He's a great scholar, so I'm sure he has, like, great reasons for saying that, and I think I have good reasons for saying that he is. So yeah, but I do want to sort of respond to maybe, like, some, I don't know, maybe typical misleading connotations that might be associated with mysticism. So, for instance, Schelling is not anti-philosophy. So Jacobi, for instance, is anti-philosophy. Jacobi's like, oh yeah, you know, like, um, because philosophy will just land you like Spinoza and atheism and fatalism. Like, stop it, stop doing philosophy, and like, just have faith. That's my non-philosophy. So that's Jacobi's view. That is not Schelling's view. Schelling is responding to Jacobi. Schelling is saying, no, right? We can still do philosophy. Indeed, right? The special kind of insight that's extra systematic, that's extra discursive, is what guides the constructions of the systems of philosophy eventually. So yeah, and I think he has different so where maybe someone like Sean McGraw would get off the boat here is when I say that, oh yeah, there is a special kind of insight that certain people have. And I think Schelling's pretty explicit about this. I think he says it multiple times in multiple ways, that some people, not all people, have this special kind of insight that is extra discursive, and that guides the construction of these systems of philosophy. And he calls it various things. So I talk about, so for instance, divine dispensation is a word that he uses for it in his early Plato notebooks. He talks, obviously, intellectual intuition is one of these words. Later on, so for instance, in the identity philosophy, he talks about exhibition in the absolute, which is a different kind of absolute cognition, or it's a different kind of special insight, one that sort of focuses on finite things, but nevertheless, it is like non-discursive kinds of insight. And then there's absolute cognition, there's genius. So these are all words for this special kind of insight that he thinks that we have. And so I think that makes him just a mystic in the sense that I mean. And like throughout the history of philosophy, I think, there are mystics who are like anti-philosophy, but there are also mystics who like hold that mysticism together with a great systematizing impulse. And Schelling is one of these people. So is, I think, Plotinus, so is Proclus, and certain sort of, I think, systematizers of the High Middle Ages. So for instance, like Maimonides or Avicenna. I think all of these people are like, they have these things and they hold them together. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and that we shouldn't be apologetic about it when it comes to Schelling. I think there's nothing to be ashamed of here. I actually think it's true that there's some kind of special insight that people can have that makes them more sort of able to do the kinds of things that that Schelling is doing, for instance. And that, yeah, so I think he takes from the Romantics and from that sort of long tradition of philosophy, that there are some things that are outside of the ken of discursive thought, and that the absolute is one of these things. And yeah, I just think, yeah, that's right, Schelling. So we should say so, because I think he's actually right about that there are things that stand beyond discursivity. Um,
So you
yeah.
actually study a period of Schelling's philosophy that I don't actually study. You do all of the identity philosophy and the nature philosophy. And I'm with you on this kind of idea of mysticism. However, I think as you state so nicely, for me it's people like Jakob Böhme and Erdinger and the great poet Angelus Silesius, and I think he takes great insight. He takes these mystical ideas, these theosophical ideas, and uses them to dynamize philosophical concepts to make them more organic and whole. So I'm with you on this idea of a kind of more descriptive, but is that the word you use? Descriptive mysticism in a sense, not just, anti-philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, discursive, I guess, or like,
Discursive,
that
sorry.
I mean, you wouldn't call it a discursive mysticism, I guess, because these are like two separate things: the special non-discursive insight and the sort of discursive system building activity. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that is right. And I mean, one thing to say about it is that I think, and again, you work on an area in a era that I'm less familiar with. So I've sort of, I work a little on the freedom essay, but beyond that, I'm like, ooh, like not yet. I'll get there one day. But But my sense from the reading that I've done is that, yeah, actually this sort of take on the early philosophy makes it less inconsistent with the later philosophy. So I think one virtue, I hope, of the book is that it shows how those elements of Schelling's thought are there even prior to his exposure to Jakob Boehme, which I think started maybe when he got in touch with Bader and other people like that. So I think those influences which come later, and that the things that he's sort of sympathetic to in them, we can see even the seeds of that in this earlier era, prior to his leaving Jena.
One of the most impressive aspects of the book um, is the theory of monism that you apply to it. Now, I'm not a big fan of. There have been earlier scholars in the 90s that called Schelling a neutral monist, and I really hated that idea. But the way that you describe um, what you call priority monism is extremely interesting. And this is why I brought up the question, because even someone like Daniel Whistler, who I absolutely love his work, has a whole argument on neutral monism that I'm always kind of like, eh. Um, but could you briefly outline what you mean by priority monism, like what it is, and how does it apply to Schelling's thought throughout this period that you're writing on?
Yeah, Chris. Yeah, I also, so I think calling Schelling a monist is born out of the very monistic things he says, for instance, in 1801 and 1802, like in reason is everything. So he says these things that are like very, very monistic sounding. And so what I wanted to do is show that there's an alternative way of interpreting those passages such that he's not also, Hegel has this critique, which is, I mean, said to be a critique of Schelling. He doesn't directly say, oh, Schelling's absolute is the night in which all cows are black, but I think Schelling is the implied target, or at least, as he says in a letter to Schelling, Schellingians or something are the implied target, certain followers of Schelling, whatever Hegel. But the yeah, so what I want to argue is that Schelling is not a substance monist. He's not a neutral monist. I think he is a priority monist. And by that, I mean something very particular. So there is a unitary being that is prior to and grounds all that exists. Nevertheless, right, there is a unity, or sorry, there's a multiplicity of relatively independent things. And you might say, well, if there's a multiplicity of relatively independent things, why would you even call it a monism? That just sounds like, I don't know, traditional theism or something. But the it's a monism because everything truly is insofar as it is identical with the absolute. Um, but through that kind of positive relation of identity with the absolute, it has a unity and integrity all of its own. It's like it's through its participation in unity and existence, it is unified and exists as a like independent, partially independent thing. So it depends on the absolute, but it's not like indistinguishable, I guess, from the absolute. So there's these relations of identity and difference. And I think this makes sense of certain of Schelling's claims, right? He says everything separates itself from the totality. This is in 1802, Further Exhibitions. So everything separates itself from the totality, insofar as it sort of is a merely composite thing. It unites in itself these sort of contrary pairs, but everything is insofar as it is in the absolute. And so these two kind of maybe seemingly statements that are in tension, but I think can be made compatible when we think about, okay, no, right? Everything participates in the absolute. And so insofar as it participates in that being and unity, it is, and it is like its own kind of unity, but also, right, insofar as it is its own kind of unity, it's distinct from the absolute. So that's the sense in which I want to say he's a priority monist, because everything depends on the absolute, is in some sense identical with it, but there is also a sense in which they are separate from it, because of precisely because of that positive relation of identity.
Well, that definitely clears up a lot of things. And I think I'm with you. I think you've persuaded me of this priority monism. So um, you have one person on your team there.
Excellent. Thank you.
The next question I'm really excited to ask you about because I read your article for Kabiri when it came out on Schelling's early Plato notebooks, and you have a whole chapter on that, and you also have a chapter on one of my favorite essays by Schelling, his commentary on the Timaeus. So you have a chapter on Schelling's 1794 commentary on the Timaeus. So what are some of the major important philosophical themes that you think that attract Schelling specifically to this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Schelling's always interested in the question of how things come to be from the absolute. Like that's a guiding from the early essays throughout. It's a problem for him, and it's one that I think is sort of a motivating problem, a sort of central kind of problem in his own uh, sort of. I mean, you also see it in I think the freedom essay as well. Um, so and I mean I don't know. I find it a very compelling problem. The idea that like, well, okay, we have this absolutely self-sufficient thing, the absolute, and then somehow it generates something, and it's like, well, how does that happen? Like, how do you get from like that thing to something that is generated that is distinct from it? And I think this is also in some sense Jacobi's problem, right? So um, and Spinoza's answer, right, is that you don't get something distinct from it. You just get it, right? That's all there is, ultimately, in a sense. So he's always interested in the question of like, how does there come to be a world at all? And insofar as the Timaeus addresses that question, he's very interested in it. I think also throughout the Timaeus, um, I mean, so there's so many things you could say, right? I mean, the story is recounted in a myth, right? And Schelling, of course, Owen Ware has this new book coming out on mythology, and Schelling sort of trying to advance. He says in 1800 he's trying to advance a new mythology, and so the idea that we can present these things mythologically rather than sort of in essay or discursive form, I think is an attractive idea for him, partly because of his mysticism. And you find also quotations throughout the Timaeus, which are interesting sort of epistemological quotations, right? Where he says things like, oh, principles more ultimate than these sort of principles I'm discussing here are known only to God and those who God holds dear. That's one that I think Schelling finds interesting. He repeats it in his 1800 Bruno. He says that to declare the maker and father of all to everyone is impossible. So I think these things all attract Schelling to the Timaeus. One thing I should say is that I think it was Bruce Matthews said that this shouldn't be called the Timaeus commentary. It should be called the commentary on the Timaeus and Philebus. And that's right. Because, I mean, I haven't counted the quotations, but it seems to me like the Philebus is the more central dialogue in the commentary, that Schelling is actually interpreting the creation story of the Timaeus through the metaphysical lens provided by the Philebus in terms of these like four principles of all being. So, and these sort of become a greater and greater theme throughout the commentary. And he just ends up sort of talking about them towards the end of the commentary. These are limit, the unlimited, mixture, and cause. So those are the four principles of all being. And they're sort of like I don't know if I can like, there's like the cause brings together limit and unlimited to form mixtures. And so this sort of, I don't know, metaphysical framework, I think you find it throughout Schelling's work, this idea of the unity of contraries, right? Where the contraries here are limit and the unlimited, and things sort of constructed out of those contraries. And in the Timaeus commentary, you see him already sort of thinking about iterative limitation of an unlimited. So, sort of the unlimited is originally limited to form matter, and then limited again to form like, these empirical objects like, animals and so on. And then those are brought to unity by a further limitation. And so everything is sort of constructed out of the iterative kind of unification of these opposed contraries. This is an idea that is just like shot through, I think, all of Schelling, this sort of unity of contraries. And it's really interesting that you find it already in this early commentary. And so, that I think is hard to overstate the influence of that. Obviously, like there are other things going on that I think Schelling is also drawing on. Like people talk about Fichte's like, Anstoß or whatever, like the Czech, or people talk about Kant's metaphysical foundations of natural science and his dynamical theory of matter as a product of opposed forces. There's scientific developments, which are also sort of like, polarity and so on, that are informing his take on this. But I think, ultimately, I think the Philebus is a really helpful framework from which to view his subsequent sort of picture of how we construct a system based on sort of how the world itself is constructed out of these opposed contraries.
Just to give our viewers a little bit of context in later Schelling, just to show them this Timaean Philebbean influence. This is from the Freedom Essay. So there is that mythos of both the Philebus of the constructing of a cosmos, and then the whole kind of demiurgos in the Timaeus, right from the Freedom Essays. So this is why your book is so important. You're mapping out the very early stages of this Platonism that is then enveloped in the rest of them. So he says this right in the Freedom Essay. He says, thus we must imagine the original yearning as it directs itself to the understanding, though still not recognizing it, just as we in our yearning seek out an unknown and nameless good, and as it moves, divining itself like a wave-wound whirling sea, akin to Plato's matter, following dark and uncertain laws, incapable of constructing for itself anything enduring. So a beautiful kind of chorology right there that harkens back to the 1794 essay.
Yeah, I like the notion there of yearning. Yeah, I think in some ways that sort of well, one thing I haven't mentioned, right, which I sort of start the book off with this quotation from Bruno, where it's like everything proceeds from the absolute, or sorry, let me read it because
Sure.
I want to get the quotation wrong. Um, he's sorry. So in Schelling's 1802 dialogue, Bruno, sorry, I'm reading from my book here. Here it is. He says that the absolute is the highest unity. It's the holy abyss from which everything comes and to which everything returns. And so the absolute as not just ground, but also telos, I think, is a really, really central idea here. And we see it as, so for instance, in nature, right? Nature is duality striving toward unity, he says. So it's divided into productivity and limitation, which I think are analogs, as I argue. They're analogs of the unlimited and limit. And nature strives toward unity. So it strives to unite productivity and limitation, and it does so iteratively, right, in order to reach a higher unity. So that ultimate unity of the absolute is not just ground, it's also telos. And I think in the early essays, you find the notion of a telos in terms of like moral progress as we strive to, approach the kind of unity from which we've fallen, or even, in art, that's a kind of bringing together of unconscious and conscious elements of the human person to create something. And that also is a kind of unity, striving for unity. So I do like, so in the Freedom Essay, as you mentioned, Chris, that's a great quotation. That notion of yearning, I think, is a yearning for unity. It's a yearning for the ground from which we've come. And that's sort of the guiding kind of framework, I think, for Schelling. And it's derived directly from Neoplatonism, this notion of like paradigmatic causality, where you have like the one is the sort of that from which everything proceeds. It's immanent in all things, and it's that toward which everything strives, or returns or reverts in some translations. So yes.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for reading that passage. That passage. I love it. I think we may have gone over this question, but who are some of the major Platonists or Neoplatonists that have influenced Schelling's own distinct Platonism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a difficult question, partly because we don't have. I wish I could go back in time and see what he was reading. Like, we don't know what he was reading at every moment of every day. So you know, claims of influence are hard to establish, but again, you know, as I mentioned, the Michael Franz book I think does a good job of sort of showing the way the sort of things that his professors at Tübingen were into, the figures and sort of schools of thought that they were probably lecturing on, um, and yeah, and so I think those Neoplatonic figures. Another person I mention in the book, which is it's unclear if Schelling ever read this person. He doesn't mention this person, is Pseudo Dionysius, who was of course very influential. Um, you know, we don't read him as much anymore, but he's this great sort of originator of a lot of a kind of mystical tradition in philosophy going forward, likely a student of Proclus. Um, so yeah, those are the major sort of figures. But I think what I hope to do was to sort of make Plato the central person. So certainly his reading of Plato. If you read the commentary on the Timaeus and think like, what in the world? It's probably because his reading of the Timaeus is influenced by these Neoplatonic figures, and his own sort of the Neoplatonic tenor of his education at Tübingen. And similarly, right, like his other early notebook writings on the ion, for instance, um, is heavily influenced by these Neoplatonic works. So he's reading Plato, he's writing about Plato in these early notebooks. I think he's writing about Plato in such a way where it's like, okay, part of the influence here, part of the influence that we need to talk about here is this sort of Neoplatonic, more hierarchical view of the world as opposed to what we think of as Platonism.
And Proclus has this like 3 volume reading of of the Timaeus. Like one book is just to the first like 10 pages of it. It's massive. So thank you so much for answering that question. My final question is, how is Schelling's Platonism manifested, particularly in 1802, the dialogue Bruno? Now, this is a great question because it harkens back to your presentation on the Bruno, I believe, at the Schelling conference, Schelling 7, I think. You were bringing up certain themes from Bruno as well, too. So there's kind of like a full circle here now.
Yeah, I think actually that talk was more on the early essays, but I'm sure I did talk about Bruno because I can hardly talk about Schelling without talking about Bruno. So yeah, for me, it all comes together in this 1802 dialogue, Bruno. And I think that's where we get the most systematic and complete presentation of Schelling's sort of overall philosophical vision. And part of the reason I end the book at 1802, I mean, I could have gone further to include, for instance, the lectures on the philosophy of art or something, but I really think Bruno is in some sense the culminating work that really sort of shows how these things fit together. I think it's just an incredible, masterful work, and that we should all read it more often. um, but yeah, so in this work, I think we see both the kind of metaphysical um, picture of things as outlined in the yeah, as I talked about earlier, I guess with the Philebus, right, where you have the sort of overarching cause, you have the opposed principles of limit and unlimited, and then you have mixtures which bring together limit and unlimited. He doesn't use exactly that vocabulary, but he uses a very similar vocabulary. at the end of the dialogue, so there's four characters in the dialogue, and it really, even the title, the subtitle of the dialogue is on the divine and natural principle of things. So that is pulling from actually that quotation of the Timaeus that I already read. So that it's got four characters, just like the Timaeus has four characters. It starts with this like prayer to the gods for divine favor. So all of these things are indications that Schelling sort of trying to present a view of, yeah, similar to what the Timaeus is doing of the origin of things. And that and the way that the dialogue progresses and ends is that we have these sort of differing characters at the beginning. At the end of the dialogue, they all present their views. They're all convinced by Bruno, who's Schelling's mouthpiece, and then they all present their own sort of distinctive views in a way like couched in that overarching Schellingian system. So so for instance, Anselm, who represents a kind of intellectualist Platonic tradition, presents a view where he says like there's the Urbild or archetype that gives rise to the Vorbild and the Gegenbild, the prototype and antitype, and produces Abbilder or images and or copies. I don't know. So those that four-part structure is, I think, drawing on the Philebus. It's of a piece with his earlier philosophy of nature, and it's very much a Platonism, as I think is indicated by the fact that Schelling puts that view in the mouth of Anselm and in a system that he clearly endorses, right? So that's one way in which I think this dialogue, this later dialogue, is really sort of showcasing these elements of Schelling's thought. The other one is in sort of advancement throughout of absolute cognition. And this is in the context of his Further Exhibitions essay, where Schelling talks about like exhibition in the absolute, constructions of system of philosophy. So he's relating in some ways. So yeah, here, sorry, let me back up a second. So one worry you might have is like, look, you say that Schelling's a priority monist and that he's a mystic, but doesn't it seem like the articulation of a priority monism would require like not being a mystic? Like if you're going to say that there is one thing or something like that, you need to articulate it in a way that you couldn't possibly articulate it if you are like a true mystic or you believe the absolute is ineffable. But here I think Schelling shows how these things fit together, because we have a kind of insight into finite things as images of absolute unity. And so exhibition in the absolute is this kind of insight where we sort of recognize in the individual finite thing the way in which it manifests the unity of the absolute. So if you can think of like having a kind of special insight into the absolute via absolute cognition, right? Or think of like the Phaedrus, where we like fly our chariots up to the highest heaven and see like beauty itself, among other things, right? And then we fall back down to earth and are embodied. When we encounter beauty itself, we recognize it. Or when we encounter, individual beautiful boys in particular, we recognize that beauty as an image of the beauty that we sort of vaguely remember from our time in the highest heaven. So there's something similar going on here, where we recognize in individual finite things the sort of a sort of shadow or image of the unity that is in the absolute. So those in that way that we can't articulate that unity in the absolute, but we can recognize that unity in the absolute, and that gives rise to this ability to construct systems of philosophy where we see the sort of distinctive unity of things, and we can construct what Schelling calls potencies, right? Progressively unified, iteratively unified, iterative unifications of these opposed contraries. So that's, I think, how Bruno really draws together all of these themes. He also talks a lot about participation, which, as I mentioned before, I think is the sort of best way of describing the relationship between individual finite things and the ground that is the absolute, that they participate in it, that they are grounded in it and strive for it. But that sort of participation, I think, gets at those relations of identity and difference that I want to say are distinctive of the priority monism that I attribute to Schelling.
And I think you're really right about this, that the Bruno dialogue very nicely systematizes Schelling's identity philosophy, or Schelling's philosophy of this period, very nicely and coherently as well too. And he's also a good writer. The dialogue flows, so there are certain philosophers that write dialogues that are atrocious, like Leibniz's new essays. If you ever read that, they're great, but they're also, some parts are completely boring. But Schelling's dialogue is quite nice. I want to thank you so much for coming here and discussing all of these themes with us and your new book. I'm excited to finish reading it, and I'm excited to send it out to the world and let everyone see this discussion and read it for themselves. And now they have some background. They can come and watch this video after reading your book. And so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's been a delight. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and again, Naomi's book is now available for purchase. Check it out. It's fantastic.